in the 15th, 16th century without any problem. And then, as I said, some of us that have an old vocabulary will have it not very actively, but we still remember that one. As far as grammar, when we move into grammar, we might find structures such as this one. The periphrasis to express obligation, similar to the one that we have in English, as in I have to. The situation in the Middle Ages is that there was variation, Middle Ages and after. There was variation in the type of preposition used. So it could be a or it could be de. If we look at this only, we might think, well, maybe the 13th century was using one and the other ones were using just de. So maybe that's the one. But if we look at another example, then we'll find a in some of the other manuscripts too. So those manuscripts are using variation between a and de in their own structures. The only ones that are repeating are the manuscript, the 15th century, and the printed version. Those are the ones that are sticking to the same type of structure. If we look at the documentation around the 15th century, we'll find plenty of examples from the 16th century into the end of the 16th century or even beginning of the 17th century. So again, it's not that the structure was problematic in any way or it had different meanings or that it was conveying something that it wouldn't be understood. This is, again, another example of they prefer one and they'll mostly use that as their preference. For syntax, we could also find elements that are used to build adverbial clauses, in this case, cada que, to introduce adverbial clauses of an action that is repeated, as in cada que quisieren confirmar con crisma. And then that is, again, repeated, except for the printed version that includes cuando. Cuando obviously was very common, and if we were looking at other examples, we would find that cuando appears in other documents, in other manuscripts too. I couldn't find the example for this one. I'm still going crazy on that, but that could be because of the different branches of where the texts are coming from originally. So it might not even be there. Or they might be omitting completely that form. And again, the printed version maintains cuando. The third case that I will show of cada que is also interesting because it shows one of the first attestations of what we use mostly today, which would be cada vez que. Right? That's what we say today. But they've been saying that since end of the 15th century or around that time. So here we would have the same example. Dijeron cada que los cristianos confesasen, and the same. And then I have here my Bible. And then cada que, and then cada vez que, which is introduced by the manuscript of the 15th century manuscript, and is copied by the printing. Now, if we were to look for cada que in the documentation, we would find it a lot, not only in the 16th century, or in the second half of the 16th century, 17th century, and in many documents, especially in Latin America, and especially Caribbean varieties, where they still use cada que. I was talking to someone from Puerto Rico, and they told me that they use it there still. True? No? Maybe? At least there is documentation from the beginning of the 20th century coming from Mexico, from the Yucatan Peninsula. All right, one more example of that type of intervention that those editors were incorporating in the printed version. Remember that one of the scholars had been talking about those endings, those suffixes in miento, and how it it was not sure, the language, whether it had to go that way, and there were maybe a different possibility. Well, maybe this could be what he was looking for, but I interpret it in a different way. So if we go to this form, agraviamiento, then we'll find it, and then it's copied, and then the printed version looks for an ending that is closer to the Latinate endings. And if we look for another example, we would find pretty much the same, where there doesn't seem to be, and here is not that we would have a different meaning with the different ending, which could happen sometimes. The suffix might include a specific, whether it's more abstract or is more related to an action. But this is not the case. We would have the same meaning. And if we look at the documentation available, then we will find it in the 15th century in documents mostly from medical, within the medical arena, but they go all the way up to the 16th century. So that is not necessarily the problem of why changing agraviamiento for agravio. Another case of miento, because I was interested in that one. We would have aparecimiento, and if we omit this reading, which is probably the wrong reading for some reason, then the other ones maintain. In the 15th century, we have the orthographic change, which is typical of the 15th century, with that increment with the S. But then in the printed version, we come up with aparición. And then again, we wouldn't have any change of meaning necessarily between one or the other. It's simply that they are looking for endings that are much closer to the Latinate endings in ion, for instance. And if we look at the documentation, aparecimiento, again, this is one of those words that is, you can find it in every century, and mostly coming from Latin America. It's still documented clearly. So it's not that the word was just out of use necessarily. All right, and then the last one with grammar, in which we see the variation between miento and ion, clearly in descomulgamiento, descomunión, and then we would have the same one, miento, descomulgación, a different root, in this case, a different root of that word, and then we would have the same, and then the same, and then the 15th century manuscript decides to standardize with one form, but then the printed version prefers the more Latinate ending. And in this case, we would have la sentencia de excomunión is amalgamated. So we would expect de excomunión. A more clearer example would come from this case where we would have miento and ción, again in variation, no problem. But then the printed version even gets closer to the Latinate form, right? That was another one of those aspects at this time. That is a kind of a paradoxical relationship, right? When you develop that standard variety, you want to be independent, you want to look like it's your own language, but you look at Latin as a prestige language, as the model, and you start adapting things. If we were to look at the manuscript tradition, we wouldn't find any big change or anything related to what happens in the printed version. So again, in this case, we would have these structures that are getting closer to that Latinate endings or form. This, by the way, has been studied and named as relatinization in a study by Harris Northall, where specifically he was including a lot of examples of how this happens over and over, where forms that are popular are brushed off or cleaned up so that they look more Latinate. It's not that the Latinate words did not exist, it's just that they're just polished so that they look Latin. And that would be that case. So once we look at what happened with the vocabulary, and once we look at what has happened with the grammar, in general, what we see is something that has been studied in standardization studies. That is a control, as described by Joseph, of those variants that are not, that for some reason are not accepted into the more prestigious variety. And as a result, what we have would be what we see with Lodge, that is the reallocation of those variants. So if we had variants, if we have a state of variation, the process of standardization would start leaning towards one, and then the other one would just be reallocated either as a variant that is perhaps suppressed in the lower status, or perhaps acquires a different meaning. So this should echo in our minds as far as what is the typical description, that the meaning of words become more fixed. Maybe it is a product of this type of action rather than just the language itself that is looking for a way to be different. So that would be, and if we look at examples of how that happens, that reallocation and that control that we've seen in the printed versions, a case in point of that reallocation could be exemplified with emencia. And we saw how it had been eliminated, and it was substituted either by fuerza or by diligencia. And then here, a few decades later, Juan Valdés en su diálogo de la lengua is saying, aún queda en algunos decir emencia por ansia. That algunos is particularly vague. We don't know whether that algunos means geographically algunos, like somewhere in the other region, or is socially. We don't know whether it means those of us who are using this or the other ones that are using the other one, or both. We don't know. But later we see in the same work how he's saying that when he speaks and writes, he's taking very good care of the type of vocabulary he uses. And he says that he prefers diligencia. So we see that the result, or that reallocation, is pretty much established at this time. And if we go a few decades later, when Covarrubias writes his dictionary in 1611, and we look at the definition of that word, we'll see ímpetu ahínco, codicia, gran diligencia, vocablo de la aldea. So now we have that connotation that it was pretty obvious at that time when someone is saying that you speak like those rustic people. So that would be the reallocation for that particular item, right? And I think it is a consequence of those standardization practices. If we look at another example of that we have presented, that would be cada, where Valdés is saying cada por siempre dicen algunos, pero no lo tengo por bueno, right? And we saw how cada que, it had been substituted by cada vez que or cuando. And here he is a few decades later picking up on that and saying that that's not his preference. So what we have here is more a result of those standardization practices than the language itself moving by its own will, so to speak, in a particular direction. So when we look at this type of descriptions, I think it is mediated somehow by that standardization ideology, that we see the big changes happening by the end of the 15th century, and then after that it's all crystal clear and very well fixed and stable. And I think what they're describing in these cases is not the history of the language, but the history of standardization more than anything else. That would be my take, but I don't know what you think. So I'll stop at that. Yeah, Michael.
Can we then judge how successful they were or were not if people were still using it 100 years later, or by the fact that nobody uses them immensely nowadays, they eventually win out? Or is it not something you could say there's winners and losers, or were most people not even using what they were writing?
You cannot say winners, losers, because the standardization keeps working its way, and sometimes it will affect completely and it will erase a particular structure or vocabulary item, or sometimes it will work on it, but it won't succeed necessarily in completely eliminating. So the case in point would be in excomunión, for instance. That's the one that everybody uses, but if you go to descomunión, you will still find it in the dictionary. That's still available. Even though that was one of the variants that they didn't prefer necessarily, but it has, variation has continued and it wasn't eliminated completely.
What percent of the population would it reach? Like you're talking about scholars.
Right, and you're right. This is a slow process and it's not necessarily something that you say, okay, what I show is how printing, the printed works are revealing what was going on. The spread or the diffusion of that change is something that has to be worked out. And that would happen, for instance, if those variants or the same type of ideology is transmitted, for instance, in education. And then you have a lot of different books that are using the same structures, and education is very powerful. Now you can tell me, well, education in the golden age was not necessarily really high. But that's why standardization has not been really truly effective until much later. But it has been working its way. It's not that it wasn't non-existent. So you can see the Royal Academy, and even when the Royal Academy is bringing the orthography, the Royal Academy didn't succeed necessarily right away. It took quite a long time before it actually came La Ley Moyano, and then education kicked in, and the orthography and education were just completely connected. But that was decades after the Royal Academy and the publication of the orthography. So it's a process.
Maybe I'm not as knowledgeable as some people, but why did you choose this text? Was it just because it was rewritten over centuries, or?
That was a key element. Partly it was a complete fluke, to be honest, because I was working on it for some other reasons, and then as I was working, I realized that it had a long tradition of manuscripts, and that allowed me to check and compare how those structures had been changing through time. So it was completely by luck at first, and then I just continued with the work. In the history of the language, I don't think there are that many texts that have been produced early, and then they have a long manuscript tradition. You might find a few from the 13th century, but you don't have that many. So that's why I'm saying that it was also partially fluke.
This might be hard to gauge, but do you have any sense of whether the editors of the first printed edition saw the variety of Spanish used by Alfonso de Simulaca's court as not just in specific words, but as a whole, as an archaic form of Spanish?
It could very well be, because some of the replacements comes with this vocabulary that Alfonso X had used ad nauseum in his documentation, and that seemed to be the target. It would be interesting to see if they had a particular idea, or I'm sure that they were thinking great things of Alfonso X. That's why they actually decided to print it, not only the Siete Partidas, but the Fuero de las Leyes and some of the other legislative works, as long as the Chronicas and all. But I don't know exactly if they had a particular vision of whether it was something antiquated or that they wanted to bring it in a new light, so to speak. So My sense is that they would say that's something old as they were trying to modernize all of that. Yep.
I'm still kind of playing with this idea of why they would change some of the lexical items to more Latin forms. Do you think that a reason could have been, I mean, obviously reason was to either appeal to or be more accessible to a particular audience, or would it be sort of, would there be sort of this prestige to create a prestige for the text?
I think a little bit of both, because the prestige obviously was there. There's if you look at the history of other languages in the standardization process, Latin, it is that type of a mirror that everybody wants to look at, and Latin is seen as this prestigious language that has all this culture, and Latin was looking at Greek, and we can go back and back. But as far as the Romance languages, they all looked at Latin as this great language that had it all. But at the same time, in that development of their own language, they wanted to be separate. And so there is this mutual, it's a contradictory relationship, I guess, in that way of developing their own language, but at the same time looking at Latin as the model because of their prestige, until eventually they would just become completely separate in their minds too, not only as something that they would study and they would say, well, you have declensions and I don't, but you don't find Castilian, you still find Romance even at this time when they're referring to the language. They don't call it Castellano, they don't call it Español. So that identity, as far as what is language identity, and the name they use for their own language, is still pretty much connected with Latin in a way. And Latin was still part of the science, education, was still supposedly in Latin. So it was everywhere. Yeah, Nate.
Were there cases in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries in which a word would kind of expand semantically to the extent that it had to be, another term had to be a repeating variant was introduced just to avoid semantic confusion? Or was that not an issue, a motivation?
It could be a motivation, not in the cases that I have presented, I don't think. But what happens is that if you start doing the type of practices that they do, then people will assign that particular meaning to that word and the other word. So guisado, for instance, nobody associates that, but nothing with the cooking.
Right.
But if that started as making explicit which context one word is going to be used or the other, that comes as a result of, or partly as a result of the standardization of this word is for this context. As in these cases, I think.
So sabor, until when was that attested to mean voluntad?
The cases that I've shown, they go all the way to the 16th century, the end of the 16th century. And you can say, even in a old-fashioned way, you can say a su sabor, and people would understand.
Yeah, I actually wanted to follow that. I was curious about that semantic meaning and a very pragmatic meaning, and if not, then basically certain people just have the right to basically dictate and not follow that normal historical development of the words. And just being in the position to do that and replace diligencia, vehemencia for diligencia, but the meaning and the pragmatic and semantic meaning
It remains, you're right, that it's not necessarily that it changes completely meaning, it's just that perhaps it becomes more obsolete or less frequent in the texts, and that's why it's pushing it down or out of use. As far as the pragmatics, the vocabulary items that I have studied, they don't participate in much pragmatics. It's not that the word order will necessarily change their meaning or that particular situation will impose another meaning added to that context. So the pragmatics in this case in the cases that I have presented, it doesn't have that much of a, doesn't intervene that much. Although I would understand why in other cases it could, that had more functionality. And I hope that that answers your question, or at least in the direction.
Yeah, just the fact that one person gets in a position to change completely.
Yeah, but remember that even though they were doing that, it's still society the one that has to accept that. Because the standardization, the fact that you intervene and manipulate and do all those changes doesn't mean anything until the rest of the society accepts, or at least a higher, bigger group of society accepts those changes. So some of the changes that they might have introduced, they didn't reach more than the 16th century, and then it came back. I haven't shown other examples, but there are cases of disponer, deponer, and they were picking one variant that eventually didn't succeed. So that's the process of standardization. It brings one change, but doesn't necessarily mean that it will remain and stay in the standard forever.
But that behavior related to the future, not modern things, how can easily a word be standardized, creating a peer group that creates that word and so forth, and then manipulate it easily.
Structure. If we look at the documentation around the 15th century, we'll find plenty of examples from the 16th century into the end of the 16th century, or even beginning of the 17th century. So again, it's not that the structure was problematic in any way, or it had different meanings, or that it was conveying something that it wouldn't be understood. This is, again, another example of they prefer one and they'll mostly use that as their preference. There was variation in the type of preposition used. So it could be a or it could be de. If we look at this only, we might think, well, maybe the 13th century was using one and the other ones were using just de. So maybe that's the one. But if we look at another example, then we'll find a in some of the other manuscripts too. So those manuscripts are using variation between a and de in their own structures. The only ones that are repeating are the manuscript, the 15th century, and the printed version. Those are the ones that are sticking to the same type of. Cuando appears in other documents, in other manuscripts too, I couldn't find the example for this one. I'm still going crazy on that, but that could be because of the different branches of where the texts are coming from originally. So it might not even be there. Or they might be omitting completely that form. And again, the printed version maintains cuando. The third case that I will show of cada case, also interesting because it shows one of the first attestations of what we use mostly today, which is in the 15th, 16th century without any problem. And then, as I said, some of us that have an old vocabulary will have it not very actively, but we still remember that one. As far as grammar, when we move into grammar, we might find structures such as this one. The periphrasis is to express obligation, similar to the one that we have in English, as in I have to. The situation in the Middle Ages is that there was variation, Middle Ages and after. For syntax, we could also find elements that are used to build adverbial clauses, in this case, cada que, to introduce adverbial clauses of an action that is repeated, as in cada que quisieren confirmar con crisma. And then that is, again, repeated, except for the printed version that includes cuando. Cuando obviously was very common, and if we were looking at other examples, we would find that